Ah, you know, it's an absolutely beautiful day outside to solve some practice problems. Today we're going to work through some practice problems with truth tables. We're going to be solving for validity, and the level of difficulty this time around is hard. All right, so I don't actually know that there are hard truth tables. They just grow. Because these arguments are more complicated, it's much easier to make mistakes, and that's where the difficulty comes in. So we're going to have to work methodically. We're going to have to make sure that we take really tiny steps. This video is completely unscripted, so you'll see me make my mistakes. If I make any, hopefully I won't, and correct them. And the reason that I want to have this video format for these practice videos is because part of what I'm trying to show you is that, yeah, these things can be tedious, and they can, even someone who's done this 1,000 times before can make a mistake or can overlook something. And with that, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to work through 3 truth tables. I've already set them up, and that'll save us some time. We don't have to go through the initial truth values every time or anything like that. My advice, pause the video, solve the truth table yourself first, and then go ahead and follow along with me or solve it again or whatever works best. The point is, I think that it's good for you to get the practice of doing it yourself and then figuring out where it is that you're prone to making mistakes so you can work on that later on down the line. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. For this particular truth table, I'm going to go ahead and start with the conclusion. There is no particular place where you have to start. There's no best practice as far as I'm aware of. So just go in whatever order it is that's easiest for you. For me, I like starting with the conclusion usually, so that's where I'm going to go. So the conclusion in this case is not Q. Q is true, true, false, false, true, true, false, false. So for the negation, I'm just going to go ahead and invert that. So that's false, false, true, true. Ooh, there we go. False, false, true, true. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight that because I'm going to be highlighting the main connective for every column. In the case of not Q, that might be a little redundant just because these are the only values in this column. But I think it's good to be consistent, right? It helps you avoid mistakes down the line. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and evaluate this conjunction, P and not R. Before you can evaluate the conjunction, you have to evaluate the negation. So I'm going to start there. Now, R is just true, false, all the way down alternating. So I'm just going to invert that. That's false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true. And now we have everything we need to evaluate the conjunction. I'm going to highlight P just to make sure that I'm looking at the right truth values. And trust me, that is where 95% of mistakes happen with truth tables. You got to make sure you're looking at the right truth values. I am prone to making this kind of mistake, so I take extra precautions to make sure I'm looking at the right stuff. So let's see. Remember that conjunctions are true when both conjuncts are true and they're false otherwise. So let's see. P is true and not R is false, so this is going to be false. True and true is true. True and false is false. True and true is true. And then notice that the last 4 rows for P are all false. So I'll know automatically that these last 4 rows also need to be false. And I will go ahead and highlight those just to make life easy. All right, and now we can go ahead and evaluate this conditional. Now, before we can actually get to the conditional, we have to figure out what this disjunction is. And before we can figure out what the disjunction is, we have to figure out what the negation is. Now, we've already evaluated not Q. It's right here in the conclusion. So I'm just going to copy those values over. So that's false, false, true, true, false, false, true, true. Now we can evaluate the disjunction. I'm going to erase the highlight here for P, and I'm going to highlight R. Right? And again, it's just so I make sure that I'm always looking at the right thing. Disjunctions are false when both disjuncts are false, otherwise they're true. So with that in mind, here we have false or true. That's going to be, oh, I still have the highlighter on. All right, false or true, that's going to be true. False or false, that's going to be false. True or true will be true. True or false will be true. False or true will be true. False or false will be false. True or true will be true. True or false will be true. Okay, and now we have all of the values for the disjunction. We can now go ahead and evaluate this conditional. So a conditional is false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Otherwise, the conditional is true. So I'm going to do as before. I'm going to highlight P just so that I know that I'm looking at the right thing. And now let's just go ahead and evaluate this thing. So truth implies truth. That will be true. Truth implies false. That will be false. Truth implies truth. That will be true. Truth implies truth. That will be true. And then the last four, again, are all false, which means that I know that all four of these are going to be true because any conditional with a false antecedent will automatically evaluate to true. It won't matter what the consequent is. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and highlight this. And I'm going to erase the highlight on P since we no longer need that. And let's just make sure that all of that is right. It is. Always good to double check your work. Okay, so now all that's left is to evaluate. When testing for validity, all we're looking for is a row where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false. If we can find that row, we know that the argument is invalid. And if we can't find that row, then we know that the argument is valid. So let's go ahead and see if we can find that row. And just to add, the only rows that you need to look at, of course, are the ones in which the conclusion is false, because what we're looking for is a row with all true premises and a false conclusion. So the first row has a false conclusion, but the second premise is false, so we have to keep looking. Here we have a false conclusion, but the first premise is false, so we got to keep looking. On row 5, the conclusion is false and the second premise is false. On row 6, the conclusion is false and the second premise is false. And there are no other rows in which the conclusion is false, which means there's no row with all true premises and a false conclusion. And so we know that this argument is valid. All right, let's move on. Here we have another argument. This one's got a more tedious conclusion. It's just got one premise, but that premise looks awful. Remember, just be meticulous. Work slowly. I know these things can be boring. I actually find them just a little bit entertaining, but I'm a huge nerd. But yeah, just make sure that you work slowly through this and you'll avoid making mistakes. Okay, so the main connective for the conclusion is this conjunction. We cannot know the value of the conjunction until we know the value of this conjunction here. And we cannot know the value of this conjunction here until we know the value of not F, right, of the negation. So looking at F, F is true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. So here I'm just going to invert those values. False, true, false, true, false, true, false, true. And now that we have this negation, we can go ahead and evaluate this conjunction. I'm going to highlight E just to make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Okay, and now let's go ahead and work through this. So remember conjunctions, if both conjuncts are true, then the conjunction is true. Otherwise, it's false. First row, true and false, that's going to be false. True and true, that'll be true. False and false, that'll be false. False and true, false. True and false, false. True and true, true. False and false, false. False and true, false. Okay, so now we have all of the values for this conjunction. Now we can go ahead and evaluate the main connective, right? So D and this conjunct over here. So I'm going to highlight D just to make sure that I don't make any mistakes here. And same thing. Let's just go ahead and see what we get. True and false, that's false. True and true, that's true. True and false, that's false. True and false, that's false. And look, and now look at this. These four rows are all false. So we know that this conjunction is also going to be false on all four of these rows. And that is our main connective. Let's see, erase this. And you'll notice that for this argument, there's only one row in which the conclusion is true. It's false in all of the other ones, which means that we're going to have to check a whole lot of rows when we're finally checking to see whether this thing is valid. All right, so let's go ahead and evaluate this monstrosity. The main connective here is a negation, right? As you can tell, it negates the value of the entire premise, right? So, okay, Before we can evaluate this negation, we are going to have to evaluate this disjunction. But before we can evaluate the disjunction, we're going to have to know the values for each disjunct. Let's go ahead and start on the left. This disjunct is also a negation. But before we can know the value of this negation, we have to know the value of the conjunction. Remember, you always start at the innermost part of the premise and you work your way outward. So we need to know the value of D and E. D and E are the first two atomic statements here. So true and true, that's true. True and true, true. True and false, false. True and false, false. These 4 rows here are all false. So I know that these 4 are also going to be false. And then to evaluate the negation, I just need to invert this, right? So we're going to have false, false, true, 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 true. And now we have the value of the disjunct on the left. Now we need to evaluate the disjunct on the right. But before we can evaluate this disjunction, we have to evaluate not D. D is first 4 rows true, next 4 rows false. So I'm just going to invert that. That's false, 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 true, 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 true. Now we can evaluate the disjunction, right? So we have true or false, that's true. False or false, that's false. True or false, that's true. False or false, that's false. True or true is going to be true. And in fact, these last 4 rows here are all true. So I know that all 4 of these will be true as well. Okay, now we have everything that we need to evaluate this disjunction. We're going to be looking at this main connective and at this connective. It's not the main connective, right? But we're going to be looking at that negation and that disjunction. And that's the actual truth value of each disjunct. And now let's go ahead and evaluate the disjunction itself. So false or true, that's true. False or false, that's false. And hey, look, the rest of these are all true. So I know that every single one of these is going to be true. And you save yourself a lot of time, grief, and headache when you really, really know the logical connectives, right? Knowing that just one of the disjuncts needs to be true in order for the disjunction to be true can save you a lot of time. I don't have to look at the other truth values. Just seeing that all of these are true lets me know that all of these here have to be true as well. Okay, and now we're finally ready to evaluate the main connective, which is, of course, a negation. And you'll look at the disjunction and you'll see we've got true, false, and then the rest true, which means that this is going to be false, true, and then the rest false. And we'll highlight that. And now what's left is we just need to check to see if there's any row in which the premise, in this case just one premise, is true and the conclusion is false. When we look at the first row, they're both false. Second row, they're both true. Third row, both false. Fourth, both false. Fifth, both false. Sixth, both false. Seventh, both false. Eighth, both false. Okay, so there is no row in which all of the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So we know that this argument is valid. And looking at the actual truth value distribution, they have the exact same truth values on every single row. So these two statements are logically equivalent, which is why the argument is valid. I should already have some videos up on logical equivalence and how to evaluate, but if not, I'll have a video on that soon. I'll also have some practice videos to work through some cases of logical equivalence. But anyway, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. The point is that the argument is valid. All right, now let's move on to the final argument. It's 16 rows because there are 4 atomic statements. I do apologize for that. I try to avoid giving my students truth tables that are quite this bad. I know some professors who will give their students truth tables that have 32 rows. I'll never do that. I don't really think these things get harder. They just get more tedious. But okay, let's go ahead and work through this. At least the premises themselves don't look to be too bad. So let's see. We'll start with the conclusion. Before we can evaluate this conditional, we have to evaluate this negation, right? So not W. W is just true, false, alternating all the way down. So I'm just going to write false, true, 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 false, true. So much fun. Okay, so now let's go ahead and evaluate the conditional. Remember, conditionals, false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, otherwise true. And I'm going to highlight Y because I really don't want to make any mistakes here. So let's see. False implies true. That's true. Truth implies truth. That's true. False implies false. That's true. True implies false. That's false. False implies true. That's true. True implies true is true. False implies false is true. True implies false is false. False implies true. That's true. True implies true is true. False implies false is true. And true implies false is false. False implies true is true. True implies true is true. False implies true is true. And true implies false is false. Okay, now let's go ahead and highlight that. And we'll erase this so that we don't make any mistakes. All right, so we have our main connective for the conclusion. Now let's go ahead and work on the third premise. So here we have W implies H. I'm going to highlight W and H so I don't make any mistakes here. All right, and let's go ahead and evaluate this thing. So we got truth implies truth, that's true. False implies true, that's true. True implies true, that's true. False implies true, true. True implies false, false. False implies false, true. True implies false, false. False implies false, true. True implies true, true. False implies true, true. True implies true, true. False implies true, true. True implies false, false. False implies false, true. True implies false, false. False implies false, true. Okay, I'm going to double check this just to make sure I didn't make any mistakes because, like I said before, I am prone to making mistakes with this kind of thing. So I'm just going to breeze through this real quick. True, 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 false, true, 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 false, true, 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 false, 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 true, true, false, 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 true, 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 false, true, 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 false, true, 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 false, 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 true, true, false, 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 true. Okay, I'm feeling a lot more confident that this is correct. I'm going to highlight these. These are the main connective. And now let's work on the second premise. So we have not Z implies Y. We got to start off by evaluating not Z. Let me erase this. So we just got to invert Z. Z is true for the first half of the rows and false for the second half. So I'm just going to invert that. False, 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 false. Let's say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfect. And so the remainder will all be true. All right, and now let's go ahead and evaluate the conditional. So for the first 8 rows, I know that the conditional is going to be true because the antecedent is false. So I'll just write true for the first 8 rows. Good. And now for the next 8 rows, since I know that the antecedent is true, I can just look at the last 8 of Y, and I'm going to highlight these just because I don't want to make any silly mistakes. I can just look at the last 8 truth values of Y, and if Y is true, then I know that the conditional will be true, and if Y is false, then I know that the conditional will be false. So let's do that. True, true, false, false, true, true, false, false. And that's it. Nice and easy. We have the values for the second premise. All that's left now is the first premise. So let's see, we have a negation, but before we can evaluate it, we need to evaluate the conjunction of Z and H. They're right next to each other, so I don't need to highlight. I'm pretty sure that I'll be able to follow along just fine. So let's see, true and true is true. 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 True and false is false. 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 And then the last 8 rows, Z is false for all of them. So I know that this conjunction is going to be false for all of them. And now let's go ahead and evaluate the negation, right? Okay, so we really just need to do the inverse, right? So, okay, here the conjunction is true, so this is going to be false. This will be false. This will be false. This will be false. And then the rest of these rows are false, which means that the rest of the rows for the negation will all be true. And we'll highlight that because that is our main connective. Okay, so that was really tedious, right? That's just how these work sometimes. Sometimes you just have to put in the work, but you'll, of course, get better at avoiding mistakes over time. And now all we have to do is evaluate. So we have to find a row where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Of course, we need to look only at the rows in which the conclusion is false. Starting with this row right here, we see that the first premise is false. Okay, moving on to the next. Oh, here we go. Here we have a row that has all true premises and a false conclusion, which means I don't have to look at anything else. Oh, let me make sure this actually shows up on the screen. I know that this is invalid. That's it for this video. If you find yourself struggling with truth tables, I promise the solution is just practice. It's tedious, I know, and it's boring advice, but doing this thing over and over and over again is the best way to get better. If you want to see more videos like this one in which I cover logic, or if you're interested in philosophy more generally, you should consider subscribing. Thanks so much for watching.